Chapter 1. And I think we'll read the preface. Dun, 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 dun. This is our first recording of our series and a bunch of shit that we're gonna attempt to read. We're going with small books as of right now. We'll see how it goes.
Small, but um not easy.
Not easy. Fucking mind benders, mind stretchers. We don't know what the body can do, and we
Mm.
don't know yet what we can comprehend out of this book. Um, we're doing this for a whole acceleration course, basically, because those people are nutty and interesting, and maybe have something intelligent to say about uh, making sense out of the world that we're in and have been in for uh, you know potentially hundreds of years, according to some people.
Hmm.
Um, but also just being uh, philosophy nerds in general. We're happy to connect and talk about this stuff. So that's kind of what brings us together to even make this um, stuff, mostly just for ourselves. And
Philosophy people tend to be obsessives in some way.
yeah, um, scatterbrained with a million different kinds of interests. This is one of them. And so there's, the key thinkers in the accelerationist movement, but those guys are, you know, standing on the shoulders of giants in philosophy. And so before we get into who we're going to kind of do this in something of a not necessarily entirely, but a chronological kind of order of philosophy. That's not really how the we're gonna go with the giants
Mm.
in the order of this like syllabus on acceleration. Um, so that when we get to read the people in um, the the thinkers in acceleration, we're going to know what they're referring to when they're saying things
Mm.
instead of working backwards from what is that person saying when they say that? What do they mean when they say that? Now we need to backtrack. We're going to start from the back and move forward. And we're not going to catch everything because there's just so much shit. But we're just going to get people that we want to talk about. And that will provide a lot of information, context for when we do get into the people that are associated with this whole genre of thought or whatever. So,
Mm. I wanted to, I don't think I've asked you this, but why you decided to want to start with Gilles Deleuze's Spinoza book?
mm,
Because I guess we could start in different areas of like an origin point of accelerationism, but you proposed this book to me first. Well, I think first and foremost because you already had a copy and because it's relatively short compared to like a lot of the other things we plan to read. Um, but if there were any other like more theoretical reasons to start here.
yeah. So, um, learning about accelerationism and Nick Land and other authors, Mark Fisher, etc., um, they use a lot of Immanuel Kant in the philosophy of accelerationism. I'm not a huge fan of Kant, and so that's going to be something of a challenge for myself in getting the context to what we're reading. Um, and So, but as to why Spinoza Deleuze Spinoza is that it's kind of just like neatly packed there, and it's not just coincidental that Deleuze has a book on Spinoza.
Mm.
Um, so you know, it, and it provides for convenience. Spinoza, I'm interested in for a lot of his ideas that lend well to multiple interests, including accelerationism as well as ecology and just metaphysics and ontology, not so much oncology, uh, but and just kind of like explaining, having an ontology um, is a good content is a great base, is a kind of like baseline context for talking about anything.
Hmm.
Um, and the so the more that I kind of read about accelerationist stuff, I was getting more learning, kind of slowly picking up on more and more Deleuze and Guattari, anti-Oedipus, and all that stuff, and slowly kind of like figured out how Spinoza was like fitting into this picture. So
Hmm.
without more information, that's kind of like the basis of it. And you know, Spinoza is in the camp of rationalists versus empiricists, which is an interesting dichotomy of thought. And I feel like more affinity towards the empiricists, and just but and Deleuze is an empiricist as well, but he's written this whole book about Spinoza, and um, there's also you will see that there's some Nietzsche in here as well.
Hmm.
So there's different there's really good lines in here to feed us um, into the accelerationist stuff. So a lot of their original thoughts are form the basis of the accelerationist thought. So
Okay.
yeah, should we get started?
Yeah.
Cool. Um, I think I'll just read the preface and then I'll pass it to you and then you'll read to some point. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we're just gonna get started. Um, we're putting this down. It's kind of committing this book to recording, and that's what this video is all about. So let's get started. So, Preface by Robert Hurley. This work is provocative from the start. A book on Spinoza, subtitled Practical Philosophy, that starts with the name Nietzsche. As Deleuze will say, we always start from the middle of things, not like us. Um, Thought has no beginning, just an outside to which it is connected. The kinship of Spinoza and Nietzsche will be made quite clear in these pages. From the underground. Uh, but there is also a historical line of connection between the two that Deleuze will discuss elsewhere. This line passes through the form that we call all too familiarly man. Spinoza is prior to that form, and Nietzsche sees beyond it. What they share on this line is a philosophy of forces or powers that compose such forms. In Spinoza's case, the historical problem was what to make of limited composites such as human beings in their involvement with perfect, in essence, infinite forces that make up the form known as God. As we know, Nietzsche is associated with the death of the latter form, but Deleuze points out that after Feuerbach, the death of God could be taken for granted, and Nietzsche was more concerned with the death of his successor, man. This seems to be useful. This seems to be a useful perspective. One reads backward from Nietzsche through man to Spinoza, and God is naturalized. One of the most fascinating parts of this book deals with Spinoza's criticism of theology. God, the legislator and judge, the planner and protector, simply does not survive. One reads forward from Spinoza through man to Nietzsche, and the overman is naturalized. The forces that are composed need not have the human reference. In any case, it seems that for us, the stronger term of Spinoza's famous equation, God or nature, is nature. The ethics merely justifies the capital letter, ethics being capitalized. Something happens to the term, however, when we join it to man. There is an effect that weakens it, affecting us with sadness. Man and nature, a tragedy. Man in nature, a pious homily. Man against nature, a hecatomb. A new kind of attention practical rather than contemplative has been drawn to Spinoza by deep ecologists. Arne Næss, the Norwegian eco-philosopher, has outlined the points of compatibility between Spinoza's thought and the basic intuitions of the radical environmental movement. See his crystal clear enumeration in Spinoza and Ecology, Speculum Spinozanum. Among them is this one. Interacting with things and understanding things cannot be separated. The units of understanding are not propositions, but acts. To the content of ideas in the attribute of non-extension, there corresponds an act in the attribute of extension. It is to the deep ecologists' credit that they read Spinoza as a philosophy of action, but perhaps it can be said amicably that they have not yet been able to describe any of the modalities of interaction except through cold science or passionate poetry. In scientific ecology, what passes between things is information, as in Bateson. In poetry, it is effects, as in Spinoza. But poetry tends naturally to form inadequate ideas of affections. Through it, we are acted upon. Deleuze offers a model in this regard. The unit of understanding is not the form or function or organism, but the composition of affective relations between individuals, together with the plane of consistency on which they interact, that is, their environment. In this conception, some rather neutral notions, such as environment and individual, are reanimated. The environment is not just a reservoir of information whose circuits await mapping, but also a field of forces whose actions await experiencing. In a human sense, it can be called the unconscious, or at least the ground on which the unconscious is constructed. Which of these actions are we capable of experiencing? What is a walk in the forest where the tick is awaiting to experience us? And what new individual do we compose when we think like a mountain? For Deleuze, for Spinoza, nature itself is an individual, composed of all modes of interaction. Deleuze opens us to the idea, which I take as a contribution to ecological thought, that the elements of the different individuals we compose may be non-human within us. What we are capable of may partake of the wolf, the river, the stone in the river. One wonders, finally, whether man is anything more than a territory, a set of boundaries, a limit on existence. I am aware that I have said next to nothing about Spinoza. The fact is that Spinoza is difficult, and this book on Spinoza is difficult, but the situation is helped by the author's word to the wise. One doesn't have to follow every proposition, make every connection. The intuitive or effective reading may be more practical anyway. What if one accepted the invitation, come as you are, and read with a different attitude, which might be more like the way one attends to poetry? Then, difficulty would not prevent the flashes of understanding that we anticipate in the poets we love, difficult though they may be. The truly extraordinary thing about Deleuze is precisely the quality of love that his philosophy expresses. It is active in everything he has written. I like very much a phrase in Arne Næss's article referred to above. Speaking of Spinoza's Amor Intellectualis Dei, he says that it implies acts of understanding performed with the maximum perspective possible. As I see it, just as a performance awaits the reader here, Deleuze maximizes Spinoza. Cool. So that's the preface.
Hmm.
Um, Anything jump out at you in that preface?
Yeah. I mean, well, we've already started reading through this book, so we kind of know some things that we're going to be going through. And one of the things that I already know that stood out to me is this constant idea of bodies interacting with each other and um, good things. Like something is good for a body if it helps it, if it interacts, another body interacts with it, and it brings about something. nice, like something strengthening for that original body,
or decomposing it
or decomposing, in which
and
case it's,
weakening it.
yeah,
Yeah.
weakening it, making a lesser constitution,
Mm,
stuff like that.
right.
Um, and so there's that idea of the bringing in the thing of like God. I guess Deleuze and Spinoza would see God as um, everything, or like it's an individual as like everything, but even within its, I think you read something like even within itself, or like even within a human, for instance, there might be non-human things
Mm,
happening. So then that, I think Deleuze will bring up an example of like autoimmune disease, where that is a thing happening in the body, the human body, the individual, yet it might not be good for that body. It might be non-human in a way.
mm,
Um, and so it's just interesting to see then how they use that as more of the idea of nature, maybe having stuff in itself that might not be good for nature, good for nature's body, we could say.
mm.
Um, so those are just like the initial thoughts I got from that preface.
Okay. Now, there's a couple things that I got out of it on the ecology thing as well. One thing that jumps out at me is something about the line about the like science, the cold science of yeah, scientific ecology. Um, what passes between things is information. In poetry, it is affects, and poetry being naturally tends to be naturally to form inadequate ideas. And that's one of the things that, in the limited amount of reading that I've done of Deleuze and Guattari, is that they use a lot of neologisms
Mm,
and they're basically having fun. They're just having fun in creating their ideas and creating new terms for their ideas. But what is a bit frustrating as someone with a modest understanding or background um, in ecology from university experience is that it seems like I've got a greater vocabulary from ecology that seems to maybe explain some of their ideas better, whereas they're
mm,
using them maybe more poetic or more in a literary kind of
mm,
sense and seem to like inadequately describe things. So they're saying, they're speaking whatever language it is, philosophy or poetry, um, but it certainly seems to be less adequate than things that are available, and maybe that's
mm,
because um, just through the passing of time, some of that vocabulary has become more developed over the last
mm,
50 years or however long, more or less. Um, but the other thing here is kind of what you were saying. Um, the I'll just go ahead and reread it again. The environment is not just a reservoir of information whose circuits await mapping, but also a field of forces whose actions await experiencing. In a human sense, it can be called unconscious, or at least the ground on which the unconscious is constructed. Which of these actions are we capable of experience? What is a walk in the forest where the tick is waiting to experience us? And what new individual do we compose when we think like a mountain? For Deleuze, for Spinoza, nature itself is an individual composed of all modes of interaction. Deleuze opens us to the idea, which I take as a contribution to ecological thought, that the elements of the different individuals we compose may be non-human within us. What we are capable of may partake of the wolf, the river, the stone in the river. One wonders finally whether man is anything more than a territory, a set of boundaries, or a limit on existence. Um, so I mean, just that, like, even those last couple sentences are seem to form like a strong basis for accelerationist thought. Um, One of the things that's hard to grasp in Deleuze and Guattari is the idea of territorialization, deterritorialization, and reterritorialization. and things like positive and negative feedback loops, um, which um, I've probably told this to you before. If you weren't already familiar with it, I'm sure we've talked about it like several times. But um, the ecologist uh, Eugene Odom um, kind of has this very useful model of homeostasis and homeoresis. And from the organism level, take a complex organism or like animal, and then step down from them as a complete thing into their subcomponent pieces. You would go from the individual to organs to tissues to cells and go further down. And all of those things are regulated by what he set point controls, chemostats, thermostats. Your body is regulated through a negative feedback loop in keeping yourself at a constant temperature. Um, and but when you go above the level of the individual organism into populations, landscapes, uh, higher levels, that's called homeoresis. And so it's not static, it's dynamic, and it's rhesus is a word for flowing. So things are more in like a flow state at higher levels versus static, kind of keeping things within certain bounds. And that goes for things as well as the economy, et cetera. Um, and yeah, I like where saying that nature itself is an individual. So like that's pretty poetic way of putting things, but it's there's a logic to it for sure. It's maybe off according to say what I just described with that homeoresis, like nature is in a flow state at that scale. Um, but again, it has all those subcomponent pieces. So it's kind of like the loci of what constitutes an individual or whatever, right? Um, the ecologist would put it at things like you and I or animals, etc. But more poetically, or going to Spinoza and talking about God versus nature or God as nature. It's what is it? Dios of natura, or I forget what the term is. It's all the other word that Spinoza uses is substance. So God, nature, and substance, those are kind of like interchangeable terms. We're all kind of there's a single basis, and I won't get I don't know my terms yet on interiority, exteriority, but basically like dwelling within is like the idea behind eminence. We'll get into that more, but so anyways, those are the things that jumped out at me while we were reading that. Um, there's one more thing here I'll read. It's two paragraphs. Let me ask you what brought you to Spinoza. Is it that he was a Jew? No, Your Honor. I didn't know who or what he was when I first came across the book. They don't exactly love him in the synagogue. If you've read the story of his life, if you've read the story of his life. I found it in a junkyard in a nearby town, paid a kopeck, and left cursing myself for wasting money hard to come by. Later I read through a few pages and kept on going, as though there were a whirlwind at my back. As I say, I didn't understand every word, but when you're dealing with such ideas, you feel as though you were taking a witch's ride. After that, I wasn't the same person. Would you mind explaining what you think Spinoza's work means? In other words, if it's a philosophy, what? In other words, if it's a philosophy, what does it state? That's not so easy to say. The book means different things according to the subject of the chapters, though it's all united underneath. But what I think it means is that he was out to make a free man of himself, as much as one can, according to his philosophy, if you understand my meaning. By thinking things through and connecting everything up, if you'll go along with that, Your Honor. This isn't a bad approach through the man rather than the work, but, and this is from Malamud the Fixer. All right, chapter one, Life of Spinoza.
How many do you want to do like a certain amount of paragraphs or like a certain amount of pages before we kind of switch back and forth?
As long as you're comfortable reading.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
you
then,
just pass it to me, popcorn it.
okay. Chapter 1, Life of Spinoza. Nietzsche understood, having lived it himself, what constitutes the mystery of a philosopher's life. The philosopher appropriates the ascetic virtues, humility, poverty, chastity, and makes them serve ends completely his own, extraordinary ends that are not very ascetic at all, in fact. He makes them the expression of his singularity. They are not moral ends in his case, or religious means to another life, but rather the effects of philosophy itself. For there is absolutely no other life for the philosopher. Humility, poverty, and chastity become the effects of an especially rich and superabundant life, sufficiently powerful to have conquered thought and subordinated every other instinct to itself. This is what Spinoza calls nature, a life no longer lived on the basis of need, in terms of means and ends, but according to a production, a productivity, a potency, in terms of causes and effects. Humility, poverty, chastity are his, the philosopher's, way of being a grand vivant, of making a temple of his own body, for a cause that is all too proud, all too rich, all too sensual. So that by attacking the philosopher, people know the shame of attacking a modest, poor, and chaste appearance, which increases their impotent rage tenfold. And the philosopher offers no purchase, although he takes every blow. Here, the full meaning of the philosopher's solitude becomes apparent, for he cannot integrate into any milieu. He is not suited to any of them. Doubtless, it is in democratic and liberal milieus that he finds the best living conditions, or rather, the best conditions for survival. But for him, these milieus only guarantee that the malicious will not be able to poison or mutilate life, that they will not be able to separate it from the power of thinking that goes a little beyond the ends of the state, of a society, beyond any milieu in general. In every society, Spinoza will show, it is a matter of obeying and of nothing else. This is why the notions of fault, of merit and demerit, of good and evil, are exclusively social, having to do with obedience and disobedience. The best society, then, will be one that exempts the power of thinking from the obligation to obey, and takes care, in its own interest, not to subject thought to the rule of the state, which only applies to actions. As long as thought is free, hence vital, nothing is compromised. When it ceases being so, all the other oppressions are also possible, and already realized, so that any action becomes culpable, every life threatened. It is certain that the philosopher finds the most favorable conditions in the democratic state and in liberal circles. But he never confuses his purposes with those of a state, or with the aims of a milieu, since he solicits forces in thought that elude obedience as well as blame, and fashions the image of a life beyond good and evil, a rigorous innocence without merit or culpability. The philosopher can reside in various states. He can frequent various milieus, but he does so in the manner of a hermit, a shadow, a traveler, or boarding house lodger. That is why one should not imagine Spinoza breaking with a supposedly closed Jewish milieu in order to enter supposedly open liberal ones, liberal Christianity, Cartesianism, a bourgeoisie favorable to the DeWitt brothers, and so on. For whenever he goes, for wherever he goes, he only asks, demands, with a greater or smaller chance of success, to be tolerated, himself and his uncommon aims. And from this tolerance, he judges concerning the degree of democracy, the degree of truth which a society can bear, or, on the contrary, concerning the danger that threatens all men. I think that'd be a good spot to.
Cool. Baruch Spinoza is born in 1632 in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam into a family of well-to-do merchants of Spanish or Portuguese extraction. At the Jewish school, he studies theology and commerce. From the age of 13, he works in his father's business firm while he pursues his studies. On the death of his father in 1654, he will manage the business with his brother until 1656. How does the slow philosophical conversation come about that causes him to break with the Jewish community, with the business, and bring him to the excommunication of 1656? We should not imagine that the Amsterdam community is homogeneous during this period. It is it has as much diversity, as many interests and ideologies as the Christian milieus. For the most part, it is made up of former Marranos, that is, Jews who outwardly practice Catholicism in Spain and Portugal, and who were obliged to emigrate at the end of the 16th century. Even those sincerely attached to their Jewish faith are imbued with a philosophical, scientific, and medical culture that cannot easily be reconciled with the traditional rabbinical Judaism. Spinoza's father is apparently a skeptic himself, who nevertheless plays an important role in the synagogue and the Jewish community. In Amsterdam, some go far as to question not merely the role of the rabbis and tradition, but the meaning of the scripture itself. Uriel da Costa will be condemned in 1647 for denying the immortality of the soul and revealed law, recognizing natural law alone. And more important, Juan de Prado will be made to repent in 1656, then excommunicated, accused of having held that the soul dies with the body, that God only exists philosophically speaking, and that faith is unavailing. Recently published documents testify to Spinoza's close ties with Prado. One may suppose that the two cases were linked together. As Spinoza was judged more severely, excommunicated as early as 1656, this was because he refused to repent and sought the break himself. The rabbis, as in many other cases, seem to have hoped for an accommodation. But instead of repenting, Spinoza wrote an apology to justify his leaving the synagogue, or at least a rough draft of the future theological political treatise. The fact that Spinoza was born in Amsterdam himself, a child of the community, must have made his case worse. Life becomes difficult for him in Amsterdam, perhaps following an assassination attempt by a fanatic. He goes to Leyden in order to continue his philosophical studies and installs himself in the suburb of Rinsburg. It is said that Spinoza kept his coat with a hole pierced by a knife thrust as a reminder that thought is not always loved by men. While it sometimes happens that a philosopher ends up on trial, rarely does a philosopher begin with an excommunication and an attempt on his life. Hence, one fails to consider the diversity of the Jewish community and the destiny of a philosopher when one believes that liberal Christian influences must be invoked to explain Spinoza's break, as if it were due to external causes. Already in Amsterdam, no doubt, and while his father was alive, he had followed courses at the school of Van den Ende, which was attended by many young Jews who learned Latin in it, along with the rudiments of Cartesian philosophy and science, mathematics, and physics. A former Jesuit, Francis van de Ende, quickly acquired the reputation of being not only a Cartesian, but also a freethinker and an atheist, and even a political agitator. He was to be executed in France in 1674, following the revolt of the Chevalier de Rohan. No doubt Spinoza also frequented liberal and anti-clerical Christians, collegians, Mennonites, who were inspired by a certain pantheism and a pacifist communism. He would encounter them again at Rheinsberg, which was one of their centers. Became friends with Gilles, Peter Balling, Simone de Vries, and the progressive bookseller and publisher Jan Roetwerts. A letter from Spinoza to Oldenburg in 1655 evokes the pacifism, and the communitarian theme appears in a letter to Gilles in 1671. However, it seems that Van den Ende remained attached to a form of Catholicism despite the difficulties of that religion in Holland. As for the philosophy of the Mennonites and Collegians, it is completely surpassed by that of Spinoza in religious criticism as well as ethical conception and political concerns. Instead of thinking of an influence by the Mennonites or even the Cartesians, one can think that Spinoza was naturally drawn to the most tolerant circles, those most apt to welcome an excommunicated Jew who rejected Christianity no less than Judaism, into which he was born, and owed a break with the latter to himself alone. Um, let's see how much further I shall go. I'll do another. Um, let's see. Among its many meanings, Jewish excommunication had a meaning that was political and economic. It was a rather frequently applied and often irreversible measure. Deprived of the power of a state, the notables of the community had no other sanction for punishing those who refused financial contribution or even political orthodoxies. The Jewish notables, like those of the Calvinist party, had kept intact a hatred of Spain and Portugal, were politically attached to the House of Orange, and had interest in the India companies. Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, one of Spinoza's professors, himself came close to being excommunicated in 1640 for criticizing the East India Company, and the members of the council that judged Spinoza were Orangist, pro-Calvinist, anti-Hispanic, and for the most part shareholders in the company. Spinoza's ties with the liberals, his sympathies for the Republican Party of Jan de Witt, which called for the dissolution of the great monopolies, all this made Spinoza a rebel. In any case, Spinoza broke not only with the religious milieu, but with the economic milieu at the same time. Abandoning the family business, he learned lens making. He became a craftsman, a philosopher craftsman, equipped with a manual trade, capable of grasping and working with the laws of optics. He also began to draw. His early biographer, Coleridge, relates that he drew himself in the attitude and costume of the Neapolitan revolutionary Masaniello. I'll pass it back to you.
Where is it?
The next last paragraph.
At Rheinsberg, Spinoza gives his friends an exposition in Latin of the work that will become the short treatise. They take notes. Gilles translates into Dutch. Perhaps Spinoza dictates certain texts that he has written previously. In about 1661, he composes the Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect, which opens with a kind of spiritual itinerary in the Mennonite manner, centered on a denunciation of wealth. This treatise, a splendid exposition of Spinoza's method, will remain unfinished. Around 1663, for a young man who lived with him and who both gave him hopes and irritated him a good deal, he presents the principles of Descartes' philosophy, supplemented by a critical examination of scholastic notions, metaphysical thoughts. Rietvert publishes the book. Gilles finances it. Balling will translate it into Dutch. Louis Meyer physician, poet, organizer of a new theater in Amsterdam, writes the preface. With the principles, the professorial work of Spinoza comes to an end. Few thinkers avoid the brief temptation to become professors of their own discoveries, the seminar temptation of a private spiritual training. But Spinoza's planning and commencement of the Ethics, as early as 1661, transport him to another dimension, a different element which, as we shall see, no longer can be that of an exposition, even a methodological one. Perhaps it is for this reason that Spinoza leaves the treatise on the emendation of the intellect unfinished, and despite his later intentions, does not manage to resume it. Uh, Note, the most precise reason for the abandonment of this treatise is to be sought in the theory of the common notions, as it appears in the Ethics, a theory that makes some arguments of the treatise inoperative or unnecessary. One should not think that in his quasi-professorial period Spinoza was ever a Cartesian. The short treatise already exhibits a way of thinking that uses Cartesianism as a means, not to eliminate, but to purify all of scholasticism, Jewish thought, and Renaissance philosophy, in order to extract from them something profoundly new which belongs only to Spinoza. The complex relationship between the exposition of the principles and the metaphysical thoughts gives evidence of this double game in which Cartesianism is handled like a sieve, but in such a way that a new and prodigious scholasticism emerges, which no longer has anything to do with the old philosophy, nor with Cartesianism either. Cartesianism was never the thinking of Spinoza. It was more like his rhetoric. He uses it as the rhetoric he needs. But all this will receive its definitive form only in the Ethics. In 1663, Spinoza moves to Würzburg, a suburb of The Hague. He will later establish himself in the capital. What defines Spinoza as a traveler is not the distances he covers, but rather his inclination to stay in boarding houses, his lack of attachment of possessions and property, after his renunciation of the paternal inheritance. He continues to work on the ethics. As early as 1661, the letters of Spinoza and his friends show that the latter are acquainted with the themes of the first book. And in 1663, Simon de Vries mentions a study group whose members read and discuss the text sent by Spinoza. But at the same time that he confides in a group of friends, he asks them to keep his ideas secret, to be careful of strangers, as he himself will be, even with respect to Leibniz in 1675. The reasons for his settling near The Hague is probably political. Nearness to the capital is necessary if he is to draw close to the active liberal circles and escape the political indifference of the collegiate group. As to the two major parties, Calvinist and Republican, the situation is as follows. The first remains committed to the themes of the struggle for independence, to a politics of war, to the ambitions of the House of Orange, to the formation of a centralized state. And the second, to a politics of peace, a provincial organization, and the development of a liberal economy. To the impassioned and bellicose behavior of the monarchy, Jan de Witt opposes the rational behavior of a republic guided by a natural and geometric method. Now, the mystery seems to be this. The people remain faithful to Calvinism and the House of Orange, to intolerance and warmongering. Since 1653, Jan de Witt is the Grand Pensionary of Holland. But the Republic nevertheless remains a republic by surprise and by accident. more for the lack of a king than by preference, and it is poorly accepted by the people. When Spinoza speaks of the harmfulness of revolutions, one must bear in mind that revolution is thought of in terms of the disappointments that Cromwell's revolution inspired, or the anxieties caused by a possible coup d'etat by the House of Orange. During this period, revolutionary ideology is permeated with theology and is often, as with the Calvinist party, in the service of a politics of reaction. So it is not surprising that Spinoza, in 1665, temporarily suspends work on the ethics and starts writing the Theologica Political Treatise, which will be concerned with the questions: why are the people so deeply irrational? Why are they proud of their own enslavement? Why do they fight for their bondages as if it were their freedom? Why is it so difficult not only to win, but to bear freedom? Why does a religion that invokes love and joy inspire war, intolerance, hatred, malevolence, and remorse? In 1670, the Theological Political Treatise appears without an author's name and credited to a fictitious German publisher. But the author is soon identified. Few books occasioned as many refutations, anathemas, insults, and maledictions. Jews, Catholics, Calvinists, and Lutherans, all the right-thinking circles, including the Cartesians themselves, competed with one another in denouncing it. It was then that the words Spinozism and Spinozist became insults and threats. And even the critics of Spinoza, who were suspected of not being harsh enough, were denounced. Doubtless among these critics, there were some embarrassed liberals and Cartesians who, nonetheless, gave proof of their orthodoxy by participating in the attack. An explosive book always keeps its explosive charge. One still cannot read the treatise without discovering in it philosophy's function as a radical enterprise of demystification, or as a science of effects. A recent commentator is able to say that the true originality of the treatise is in its considering religion as an effect, not only in the causal sense, but also in the optical sense, an effect whose process of production will be sought by connecting it to its necessary rational causes, as they affect men who do not understand them. For example, the way in which natural laws are necessarily perceived as signs by those who have a strong imagination and a weak understanding. Even when dealing with religion, Spinoza polishes glasses that reveal the effect produced and the laws of its production.
Right. In his ties with the Republican Party and perhaps the protection of DeWitt that saves Spinoza from a more specific kind of worry. I think I read that wrong. I will read it again. It is his ties with the Republican Party and perhaps the protection of DeWitt that saves Spinoza from a more specific kind of worry. As early as 1669, Auerbach, the author of a philosophical dictionary denounced for its Spinozist leanings, had been arrested and had died in prison. But Spinoza had to leave the suburb where his life is made difficult by the pastors and take up residence in The Hague. And above all, this is at the cost of silence. The Netherlands are at war. After the De Witt brothers are assassinated in 1762 and the Orangist party has returned to power, there can no longer be any question for Spinoza of publishing the Ethics. A brief attempt in Amsterdam in 1675 easily convinces him to give up the idea. Certain theologians took the occasion to complain of me before the prince and magistrates. Moreover, the stupid Cartesians, being suspected of favoring me, endeavor to remove the aspersion by abusing everywhere my opinions and writings, a course which they still pursue. For Spinoza, there is no question of leaving the country, but he is more and more alone and ill. The only milieu in which he might have lived in peace fails him. Yet he receives visits by enlightened men who want to know the ethics, even if this means joining with its critics subsequently, or even denying that these visits were paid to him, as in the case of Leibniz in 1676. The professorship of philosophy at Heidelberg, in which the Elector Palatine offers him in 1673, does not tempt him. Spinoza belongs to that line of private thinkers who overturn values and construct their philosophy with hammer blows. He is not one of the public professors who, according to Leibniz's approving words, do not disturb the established sentiments, the order of morality, and the police. Since it has never been my wish to teach in public, I have been unable to induce myself to accept this splendid opportunity, though I have long deliberated about it. Spinoza's thinking is now taken up with the most recent problems. What are the chances for a commercial aristocracy? Why has the liberal republic foundered? Is it possible to change the multitude into a collectivity of free men instead of a gathering of slaves? All these questions animate the political treatise, which is left unfinished symbolically at the beginning of the chapter on democracy. In February of 1676, Spinoza dies, probably of a pulmonary disease, in the presence of his friend Meyer, who takes possession of the manuscripts. By the end of the year, the opera postuma are published at the expense of an anonymous donor. This frugal, propertyless life, undermined by illness, this thin, frail body, this brown, oval face with its sparkling black eyes. How does one explain the impression they give of being suffused with life itself, of having a power identical to life? In his whole way of living and thinking, Spinoza projects an image of the positive, affirmative life, which stands in opposition to the semblances that men are content with. Not only are they content with the latter, they feel a hatred of life. They are ashamed of it. A humanity bent on self-destruction, multiplying the cults of death, bringing about the union of the tyrant and the slave, the priest, the judge, and the soldier, always busy running life into the ground, mutilating it, killing it outright or by degrees, overlaying it or suffocating it with laws, properties, duties, empires. This is what Spinoza diagnoses in the world, this betrayal of the universe and of mankind. His biographer Coleridge reports that he was fond of spider fights. He looked for some spiders and made them fight together, or he threw some flies into the cobweb, and was so well pleased with that battle that he would sometimes break into laughter. Animals at least teach us the irreducibly external character of death. They do not carry it within, although they necessarily bring it to each other. An inevitable bad encounter in the order of natural existences. But they have not yet invented that internal death, universal sadomasochism of the tyrant slave. In the reproach that Hegel will make to Spinoza that he ignored the negative and its power lies the glory and innocence of Spinoza, his own discovery. In a world consumed by the negative, he has enough confidence in life, in the power of life, to challenge death, the murderous appetite of men, the rules of good and evil, of the just and unjust. Enough confidence in life to denounce all the phantoms of the negative, excommunication, war, tyranny, reaction, men who fight for their enslavement as if it were their freedom. This forms the world in which Spinoza lives. The assassination of the DeWitt brothers is exemplary for him. Ultimi barbarorum. In his view, all the ways of humiliating and breaking life, all the forms of the negative have two sources, one turned outward and the other inward. Resentment and bad conscience, hatred and guilt. The two arch enemies of the human race, hatred and remorse. He denounces these sources again and again as being linked to man's consciousness, as being inexhaustible until there is a new consciousness, a new vision, a new appetite for living. Spinoza experiences that he is eternal. Second paragraph on the right side.
In Spinoza's thought, life is not an idea, a matter of theory. It is a way of being, one and the same eternal mode in all its attributes. And it is only from this perspective that the geometric method is fully comprehensible. In the Ethics, it is in opposition to what Spinoza calls satire. And satire is everything that takes pleasure in the powerlessness and distress of men. Everything that feeds on accusations, on malice, on belittlement, on low interpretations, everything that breaks men's spirits. The tyrant needs broken spirits, just as broken spirits need a tyrant. The geometric method ceases to be a method of intellectual exposition. It is no longer a means of professorial presentation, but rather a method of invention. It becomes a method of vital and optical rectification. If man is somehow distorted, this torsion effect will be rectified by connecting it to its causes more geometrical. This optical geometry traverses the entire ethics. People have asked whether the ethics should be read in terms of thought or in terms of power. For example, are the attributes powers or concepts? Actually, there is only one term, life, that encompasses thought. But conversely, this term is encompassed only by thought. Not that life is in thinking, but only the thinker has a potent life, free of guilt and hatred. And only life explains the thinker. The geometric method, the profession of polishing lenses, and the life of Spinoza should be understood as constituting a whole. For Spinoza is one of the vivants voyants. He expresses this precisely when he says that demonstrations are the eyes of the mind. He is referring to the third eye, which enables one to see life beyond all false appearances, passions, and deaths. The virtues, humility, poverty, chastity, frugality, are required for this kind of vision, no longer as virtues that mutilate life, but as powers that penetrate it and become one with it. Spinoza did not believe in hope or even in courage. He believed only in joy and in vision. He let others live, provided that others let him live. He wanted only to inspire, to waken, to reveal. The purpose of demonstration functioning as the third eye is not to command or even to convince, but only to shape the glass or polish the lens for this inspired free vision. Quote from Henry Miller. You see, to me it seems as though the artists, the scientists, the philosophers were grinding lenses. It's all a grand preparation for something that never comes off. Someday the lens is going to be perfect, and then we're all going to see clearly, see what a staggering, wonderful, beautiful world it is. Unquote. And that's chapter 1. Unless you wanted to read the bibliography, but I think that's a little dry.
Yeah, we don't need to do that. Um, well, I feel like it really picks up a lot in the last like couple of pages where it's dealing more with ideas than his biography, but it's all like still very interesting to me. So I enjoyed reading that again. Um, so I've got a few notes, but I'll still need to collect my thoughts here.
I could start off with some of the things I underlined and highlighted
Oh, perfect.
earlier.
Yeah.
Well, I guess first I want to say that I find it kind of funny that Deleuze starts this off by just talking about Nietzsche first
Yeah, like the first word almost or something. Yeah, yeah,
instead of Spinoza.
right,
But I think he's kind of having fun with it. He's like saying, "This is how I'm gonna kind of get you." He's almost like emceeing in a way of like,
right,
ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce my next guest, let me let me warm you up into like
right.
why it's gonna be great, you
Yeah.
know. Um,
Well, with the syllabus that we've written, we have Nietzsche and Schopenhauer on there, and towards the end, we're talking about like affirmations of life, and um, life can be like super ugly, and there's a lot of like nasty shit inside of it. Um,
spider fights.
and spider fights are a part of it. Spider, your housefly brutality. Um, um, but we're reading about it's mentioning wars, tyrants, people fighting for slavery as if it was their freedom, stuff like that. So all topically super relevant right now. um, and I think like what they're saying, well, I mean, fighting for your like slavery um, is is kind of like sort of like fighting for your death, or maybe this may or may not be like a Bataille thing, but or even thoughts of like Freud, or what's the other guy's name? I'm gonna blank on it right now. But just having like the death drives,
Hmm.
so uh, freedom and life are often uncomfortable, and so the only thing that is certain and has a, a totality and completion to it is death.
Hmm.
And so subconsciously, that's maybe like what people are like chasing after in order to, what are things that are close to like the totality of death, but the totality of like a dictator and telling you just these are the bounds in which you're going to live your life, and
Hmm.
your freedoms are restricted. Um, One thing I wrote on here is just kind of like the humanistic kind of the body of work in existentialism, and existentialism as part of like humanism. And like Sartre like writes about just the kind of like the desire, uh, just how terrifying freedom can be, because like ultimate freedom is just kind of like dizzying, to have like no bounds, and we kind of want to like self-impose limits on ourselves to give ourselves like some kind of direction.
Isn't that also like Kierkegaard?
That's very,
So
oh yeah,
like,
Kierkegaard's an existentialist, and he would definitely, I mean, he was also
was it like
believed in God, but
was this quotation like freedom is the dizziness of man or something?
sounds
Something like
sounds
that.
accurate, yeah, for sure. um but so what was it, so with Nietzsche, yeah, so Nietzsche is like very, so Nietzsche's on like the, if there were camps, we would put Nietzsche in the affirmative camp. It's all about living life to its fullest. There's some connections between Spinoza and Nietzsche on, say, like an ascetic kind of lifestyle, or Nietzsche's uh, within, according to like with Nietzsche, he was like, he was really against drinking and being under the influence. That was kind of like an escape instead of like embracing life. It was a liquid material chemical form of denial and escape, um, and negation, stuff like that. Um, so, so within the syllabus, we've got Nietzsche in the affirmationist camp, and then within the negation and the no camp would be Schopenhauer.
Mm.
And there is a part in here where it talked
The
about
antinatalists of the world.
yeah, right, the antinatalists, which is further down in our reading list as
Mm.
well. Um, And it mentioned somewhere in here that some sort of like reproach from Hegel on not grasping on um, you're missing this whole wonderful world of negation, Nietzsche. You fucked up. I mean, Hegel came quite a 100, 200 years later, or something like that.
Oh, you mean not blaming Nietzsche, blaming Spinoza.
Blaming Spinoza. He was giving Spinoza a hard time for missing out on the whole negation thing.
Mm.
Um, Schopenhauer hated Hegel. He thought Hegel was a garbage writer. Um, but uh, but Schopenhauer is also very he's all about negation. The world is will and power, right? Yeah, world is will and representation. Anyways, like there's this force, and this could be mapped out or territorialized, say, into like and multiple kinds of like representations. Um, uh, Maybe like interesting way to juxtapose Spinoza and Nietzsche would be with Schopenhauer, and he's saying, like that there's this underlying like will in nature. It's basically out of our nature to do X, Y, and Z, like fuck and kill or something like that, right? But there's just like this almost like Lovecraftian sort of like a cosmically fucked up baseline that is driving everything uh, down to animals hunting each other, et cetera, or whatever. Spider fights, killing flies. Um, but anyway, so that's going to be really great to juxtapose these two thinkers. And the last thing I'll say as we before we move on is like um, going back to the ecology thing with the positive and negative feedback loops in systems, organisms, information, cybernetics. Um, how how does that map with affirmation and negation as well, right?
Mm.
So those are two like philosophical, poetical, scientific, ecological. How do all those kind of things like dance together or relate? Are they just like connotative or whatever? But it'll be interesting to kind of like look at all those things over.
Hmm.
So, what else you got?
Well, I guess I mentioned the Nietzsche part initially because Deleuze talks about the mystery of a philosopher's life is this thing of the ascetic virtues, where he keeps mentioning humility, poverty, and chastity.
Mm.
Um,
Those are things that Schopenhauer is really big on asceticism.
mm,
Um, I don't know if chat gave me accurate information. I
your
got
friend chat.
my friend chat, yeah. My friend chat was telling me that that Nietzsche was actually like a student of Schopenhauer, and I don't know how closely. And so Nietzsche was kind of like originally like on board with Schopenhauer in
Mm,
his early philosophical development, and then just grew further away. And by the end, we've got you know polar opposites, which is also interesting in relation to things that we described as composition, decomposition, good versus evil, and versus good versus bad. Good
mm,
versus bad being what is good for you, what is bad for you,
mm,
as opposed to what is good versus evil. So not like a moralizing thing, but like an ethical or like an into the integrity of a thing,
mm.
something being good versus bad. Um, Shoot, I'm about to lose the thread. Um, what was the original? So chat,
The
my
ascetic
friend chat, the
values.
ascetic values. So both, well, I don't know how Nietzsche feels about asceticism. I believe, well, Spinoza was definitely an ascetic for sure. Schopenhauer was an ascetic. Um, Nietzsche, I suppose, could be an ascetic.
Mm,
There's maybe some ways where he is and ways where he's not. I mean, he abstains from drinking, that's for certain.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Um, well, I guess I just find it interesting why Deleuze would bring that up.
mm,
But I think what he's trying to maybe tie into is how Spinoza really just wanted to think.
And there's life in there. It's life and thought is what
Yeah,
we were touching on at the end.
yeah. And Spinoza, but Spinoza lived a life where that thinking basically put him in trouble constantly.
Right. It
So,
threatened his thought threatened his own life.
mhm.
Or his thought gathered him
His
enemies.
needing to express his thinking
Mm,
uh was
drew enemies.
yeah, basically
Yeah.
brought a lot of denunciation
The
and
only thing that I wrote on that is that philosophy is potentially an escape, but more to like a greater cause or bigger thing. But I think that while I wrote that down, I think the bigger takeaway is the the relation to life and thought. And we'll get into that more as we read this book and read others. But that's going to present itself as a as some tricky shit for us to talk about because it's both the language and vocabulary of 16th, 17th century philosophers, as well as just like trying to break into like their logics or what it like their conceptualizations of
mm,
stuff. Like they're just using things that it's like once they've said the words, it's kind of like hard for us to say something else because now they've framed it sort of.
mm,
But they talked about Cartesians, stupid Cartesians.
mm,
I feel that Descartes was fucking dumb myself. I
mm,
don't know much Descartes. We don't need to go backwards. We're not going to go into reading any Descartes.
mm,
Um, but Descartes was a dualist um, and had developed this thing called like the mind body problem. And they were saying that, okay, Spinoza was like, I see that Descartes, okay, like that Descartes' good for its rhetoric, but like the content is bullshit.
mm,
Um, I was looking at timelines for these guys, and there's I don't know how many years. There's several decades of overlap between them. So Descartes is, I'm guessing, French.
mm.
Um, uh, Spinoza is
Like
Deutsch or
yeah,
whatever the
like
fuck Netherlands is.
Jewish, Portuguese, Dutch.
Right, right. Jewish, Portuguese, Dutch guy, but they're all like, kind of in close proximity in Western Europe with timelines overlapping. Um, and, um, but yeah, so just there's the life and then there's the thought, and then we're going to go further down and we're going to talk about the relationship of the mind and the body. And this was some of the things that I was emailing you was like, I was trying to understand what Descartes' concept of mind was the mind um this like neurological scientific, was it the brain, like what's the
Mm,
difference between the mind and the brain, the same as like the soul and the identity or the person, or like
mm,
what's the overlaps between those things. And so it's like I'm going to forget these words, it's like res cogitans or something and res whatever. um but for him there was like these, they interacted together but they were like distinct and individual. Spinoza says otherwise about these things we talk about in some of the next chapters about things being extended, particularly the body. So extension is basically like extension is it's like time and space. It's um, you know, like mass or volume and like dimensions, little dimensions. Like your leg is so long and has circumference, and it occupies space. Whereas the mind um, is also of substance,
mm.
but it doesn't occupy dimension. It's like thought, and in relation to that. Um,
Should I pause?
um, we'll just pause speaking, or are you sure you can pause there? Um, So, um, and so, uh, so yeah, so like asceticism and kind of like the relation to life and to thought. He was a lot. I don't. Maybe I kind of want to go back and like reread some of that out loud. Maybe we won't do that, but um, I mean, yeah, just like like talking about life in here and its relation to thought is maybe something to highlight again. I don't know if you have it highlighted in there, but that's actually like that's some fertile ground for, I guess, maybe just getting us to know more of Spinoza. I don't know uh, about relation to acceleration. Um, but what else you got?
Well,
What do you think? Or what else do you think?
I actually saw a little bit more of my notes or what I highlighted, and now I remember what I wanted to bring up regarding the ascetic values that Deleuze is bringing up of like the the values of a philosopher, and it's that he says the philosopher's solitude dot cannot integrate into any milieu. So the
Nietzschean,
idea,
Nietzschean, so Nietzschean,
I guess so, yeah. Well,
super Nietzschean.
the idea being that like Spinoza didn't really fit into any neat group
Right.
in his lifetime.
Loner.
Be yeah, a loner because he wanted to go along with the thought that was kind of beckoning him.
Mm,
But it wasn't politically savvy. It wasn't financially stable.
mm,
It severed ties with people, um, whether because they disagreed with him or because they were pressured to disagree with him.
mm.
So kind of the idea that if you're gonna go off exploring thought, that it could be a solitude that you experience in your lifetime.
Not in our experience.
I don't know if we're doing philosophy
No,
necessarily.
we're not.
I mean, we're talking about it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we're not. If we have our own thought about something, well, and Deleuze also mentions it that like Spinoza probably wanted to go to a lot of these places, or mentions that like going to these places where democracy and liberal values are upheld is not because they're the best way of like a society to run, but if you go to those places, they're probably just going to be more tolerant of you trying to pursue some thinking.
Mm,
Um, and so that's kind of like why Spinoza probably try to be in those places.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, so man, there's quite a bit there. We were talking earlier today about, societies of control with Foucault and Deleuze. And, so that there's something to think about there with just what the society and what the milieus were existing at that point that facilitated or fostered or like hindered people in their freedom, freedom of action, freedom of thought. um his life was you know he kind of like lost probably a considerable amount of freedom by being excommunicated.
mm,
um but he's also one other thing to think about too in relation to Descartes and Spinoza's lifestyle or just the idea of asceticism is like um like, okay, so we've got things that compose us and decompose us that are healthy or that that it make us healthier or make us more ill, um and take whatever substances. Maybe it's like pure organic food or alcohol or whatever. Maybe you're abstaining from some of them. Maybe you're abstaining from all of them. You're abstaining from social interaction with others. Um, Spinoza talks about engaging in the sad passions, resentment, satire, and um, that um, also has a connection to the to kind of back to Descartes and some of the stuff I was reading in preparation for this, and that like with the mind body problem, it, from what I was reading, I could be off on this, but my interpretation of kind of like what I read was like Descartes was kind of having like a chicken and egg fucking problem with like the
Mm.
mind and the body and like thinking about how they're these distinct things. But he also is saying that like, you know, one thing happens in one and it's, you know, maybe triggering this thing or they're happening together even at the same time. But interactions in social milieux, interpersonal levels, um, eh, what is the makeup of asceticism? You're turning all of these things off, right?
Mm.
And from substances to interactions, so on and so forth. So this guy is getting kind of is like sensory deprivation tank almost lifestyle, where he's turning a bunch of shit off and he's just kind of like really giving himself over to thought. And that was his life. His life was thought. Thought is life. Um, and there's these other Spinoza's terms that we'll get to in the dictionary, probably, like idea of. I'm not even going to attempt to go over that kind of shit right now, but yeah, there's just a lot. I don't know that you highlighted that there's certainly a lot there for sure.
Yeah, or at least like what Deleuze is like highlighting in this first chapter about Spinoza's personal life seems to be this idea that um a philosopher kind of stands alone.
Mhm.
Um and
Yeah.
regardless of which groups they're part of and that they kind of get folded into more tolerantly or like accepted wise, um there is like a sense of uh kind of being a little bit of the outsider in a sense.
Mhm.
And
The holy mountain.
yeah, I mean the ascetic in some ways,
Right,
right?
right.
The ascetic can still exist in the village,
Mm,
but they are kind of seen as a bit separate.
right. Yeah, if you know, there's this new channel, you watch, what is it, Esoterica or whatever the hell it is.
Hmm.
You familiar with that one? So,
Yeah.
that guy has, I think, a few videos on, you know, the esoteric or like mysticism of Spinoza or something like
Oh,
that.
okay. He does a lot of Jewish related stuff.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I'm less interested in that kind of stuff, but it might be important to engage with in future endeavors related to things that we talked about earlier this morning, creating, you know, spiritual programs or whatever.
Well,
But
the esoteric stuff will definitely come back around with like Nick Land.
oh, for sure. Yeah,
You know, so
that's some of the esotericism and occult shit is like something that I'm trying to determine how much I need to engage with. And it's not for like valuing it in itself,
mm,
but as like more of a means.
mm,
Because I'm just so turned off by that stuff
mm.
at this point in my life. But yeah, there's the Esoterica channel talks about, oh, was Spinoza a mystic or an esotericist or something like that? And we read it somewhere in there, something about like my question is where is that guy taking it from? But there's that passage in this book where it mentions him being a hermit. Um,
Mm.
and so, you know, fucking hermeticism, hermits, not the same things necessarily, but like just yeah, the whole fucking, you know, solitary wizard, right? Kind
Yeah.
of shit. Um, but like, you know, like it's so there's very obviously like you can certainly see um Nietzsche when we're talking about being solitary. You know, it's like
Mm.
you're walking, you're climbing the mountain, the Nietzschean mountain, right? And having like that philosopher like vantage point, like looking down on all the fucking simpletons.
and for some, I mean,
Well, one
in
of
certain contexts, that's all very interesting within different kinds of contexts. Like
mhm,
the revolutions at that time, we think right now we're ready for a revolution, but um, who, I mean, I think we're ready for a revolution on the left and the right at this point. Um, but in Spinoza's time, revolutions were something that were conducted majority by these reactionary groups, and that's why he
mm,
wasn't engaging in that stuff. What's funny is that he was more radical than they were. I mean, they were trying to suppress themselves and repress
mm.
themselves through their revolutions, and they were looking at they were looking to kill him or jail him or whatever.
Well, it seems like Spinoza's, if there was anything revolutionary with him, it was never a political one.
Ooh,
I
I don't
would
know if I
say
agree with that.
I would say it's more of a way of approaching life and thinking. I mean, it has maybe I would say it has political implications,
Mm,
but I wouldn't say he was trying
political
to
agenda.
trying to have a political agenda
Mm,
to espouse and
mm.
say this is what we should do instead more like
Some sort of manifesto.
yeah,
He
yeah.
wasn't going for some political manifesto. Yeah. Um,
But I also have this note that says Spinoza dunks on simpleton religious thought.
yeah.
And I can't remember like which part. I think it's the part where it was all those people who were um like barring his theological political treatise where it says the Jews, the Catholics, the Calvinists, the Lutherans, they were all competing to see how can we denounce this work from Spinoza
Mm,
even more,
right.
you know.
Yeah. Compete. Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Who's got
who can like
who's got more street cred for
yeah,
attacking this guy? Yeah.
yeah. Which is not we could still see that today in the internet age.
Right.
Who has the best dunk on someone
Right.
on issue B,
Right.
issue C.
Right. Um, do I have anything on that? Let's move from there. What else you got?
Um, that's mostly it, but then maybe this is kind of tying in with what I was just saying about maybe Spinoza not being uh necessarily a political subject, but maybe a like a something else, which is Deleuze in one of the last parts says, in Spinoza's thought, life is not an idea, it is a way of being.
Mm,
So
right.
I'm not exactly
But
sure. I mean, maybe we'll get more into what that means as we read.
I think that's really important to Spinoza in general, um, because it it sifting through that stuff. I mean, what is what is the quote? It's not an idea, it's a way of being. Life is not an idea, it's a way of being. Is that the quote? Um,
Yeah.
this book is called Spinoza
Yeah.
Practical Philosophy. So, uh, what is practical? It's a way of being, right? So life has its practicalities. Um, but but for Spinoza, maybe life is an idea, but life is thought. And so like, whoa, like how do you wait, it's like when you think when you have thoughts, you have ideas. Actually, again, this goes back to this is going to go back to Descartes a little bit as well, but so like baseline is substance, and then we've got like the modes and attributes, and we have to define all these things. But like there's there's these relations, one to many, many to many, many to one. Um, these are things that those uh, in a concept of relations. The concept of relations. This is like really high level. applies to things just like geographic information systems and mapping, like how, relational database models, tables, stuff like that. And how does a table relate to a geometric feature like an arc or something like that? Um, Many to one, one to many, stuff like that. Anyways, yeah, there's gonna be so many times where we're getting fucking meta. And not well in both uh postmodern and not postmodern ways.
Mm.
But so anyway, so there's like kind of like two things, like there's an attribute, there's a single unique attribute to the extended, which is say the body, and an attribute of I guess extension is the attribute of the body and thought is the attribute of the mind. Um,
Mm.
and then ideas would be like, I forget how that how ideas relate to thought, but maybe like it's a mode of thought is an idea or something like that. We'll get into it's I think it's important though. And like I think we might have failed reading this if we haven't, you know, expressed it and regurgitated it, you know, passing some sort of self-imposed test on our comprehension of
Mm.
Spinoza and bringing it and making it, useful to any for future reading that we do.
Mhm.
But we're not going to Descartes and stupid Cartesians. There's a little bit of Descartes to know. We don't need to know any books, but a lot like I think it's kind of like slightly useful to know like, okay, contextualizing contextualizing Spinoza. Um, we want to get just like a little bit of Descartes, because Spinoza was working on Descartes' ideas.
And
Um,
Descartes never goes away, I feel like, in
yeah,
philosophy.
no,
So if even if people can generally agree that his ideas seem a little bit too rushed to a conclusion, perhaps, it can't be argued that he has had such a profound he's been a profound foil for so many thinkers throughout history
mm,
that like he just can't be ignored.
yeah. I will maybe immediately after this or somewhere in the middle of this, we'll have to go back over this Techne and the genealogy of Techne paper I think I
Hmm.
shared with you. But that would be like that would be an additional fast read
Hmm.
to kind of help us with kind of like, okay, super fast into, you know, Greek philosophy or just the genealogy of this of something that could help us in thought. But yeah, we'll always start from the middle of things. Thought has no beginning, just an outside to which it is connected. So, you know, yeah, Descartes, they're all going to be there at some point or other. Just how much we have to read of them.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
um,
How are you? Do you have any like wrapping thoughts? I feel like
how are we doing
we've
for
been
time?
going, I don't know. I haven't checked.
Well, would you mind if we reread a little bit of the stuff at the end here?
Sure.
Okay, I want to take it one, two, three, four, 5 pages. Why are they proud of their own enslavement? Why do they fight for their bondage as if it were freedom? Why is it so difficult not only to win, but to bear freedom? Why does a religion that invokes love and joy inspire war, intolerance, hatred, malevolence, and remorse? In 1670, the theological political treatise appears without an author's name and credited to a fictitious German publisher, but the author is soon identified. Few books occasioned as many refutations, anathemas, insults, and maledictions. Jews, Catholics, Calvinists, Lutherans, Cartesians, that they were like Spinoza. Tuh. Um,
I
and even
spit on Spinoza.
Spinoza. And even the critics of Spinoza who are subjected, I am going to skip past this. Oh, effects. Okay. An explosive book always keeps its explosive charge. One still cannot read the treatise without discovering in its philosophy's function as a radical enterprise of demystification or as a science of effects. A recent commentator is able to say that the true originality of the treatise is in its considering religion as an effect, not only in the causal sense, but also in an optical sense, an effect whose process of production will be sought by connecting to it to its necessary rational causes as they affect men who do not understand them. For example, this way in which natural laws are necessarily perceived as signs by those who have a strong imagination and a weak understanding. Even when dealing with religion, Spinoza polishes glasses that reveal the effect produced and the laws of it. That's poetic itself, just that this guy was like working on lenses which are increase, expand your vision, right, in your sight. Like they say, the demystification. It is his ties with the Republican Party, perhaps the protection to wit, that saves Spinoza from more specific kind of worry. Let's see. He moves the Hague, cost of silence, Netherlands at war, DeWitt bros assassinated, the Orangists. Certain theologians took the occasion to complain of me for the prince's magistrates. He's being attacked. Um, I think one thing I take in there too is like when we read Nietzsche, it's like thus spoke Zarathustra. It's like there's this story of like character walking the tightrope, and there's all these people below that are like jeering and sneering and laughing and spitting and cussing, and it's all kind of all directed at this person that's like walking this like tightrope. Um, and it's kind of about like the sort of the life that you're leading, and there's just all these like spiteful, hateful, parasitic simpletons that are just like jeering at you or whatever.
Mm.
But like, I mean, you know, Nietzsche was a bit of an edge lord, but like Spinoza was like his life was fucking threatened, like for real, you know. Um, so he receives visits by enlightened folks, blah blah blah. Okay, he doesn't want to teach in public. He renounces that, so he's not a PMC guy himself. um, see, I love this part. This frugal, propertyless life, undermined by illness, this thin, frail body, this brown oval face with its sparkling black eyes. How does one explain the impression they give of being suffused with life itself, of having a power identical to life? In his whole way of living and of thinking, Spinoza projects an image of the positive, affirmative life which stands in opposition to the semblances that man are content with. Not only are they content with the latter, they feel a hatred of life, and they are ashamed of it. A humanity bent on self destruction, multiplying the cults of death, bringing about the union of the tyrant and the slave, the priest, the judge, and the soldier, always running life into the ground, mutilating it, killing it outright or by degrees, overlaying it or suffocating it with laws, properties, duties, empires. This is what Spinoza diagnoses in the world, this betrayal of the universe and of mankind. His biographer, Coleris, reports that he was fond of spider fights. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Skip spider fights. They don't care it within, although the inevitable bad encounter in the order of natural existence, but they have not yet invented that internal death, the universe, the universal sadomasochism of the tyrant slave. Um, and the reproach that Hegel make to Spinoza that he ignored the negative and its power lies the glory and innocence of Spinoza in his own discovery. In a world consumed by the negative, he has enough confidence in life, in the power of life, to challenge death, the murderous appetite of men, the rules of good and evil, of the just and unjust, enough confidence in life to denounce all the phantoms of the negative. Excommunication, war, tyranny, reaction, men who fight for their enslavement as if it were their freedom. This forms the world in which Spinoza lives. The assassination of DeWitt is exemplary. Ultimi Barbarorum
In his view, all the ways of humiliating and breaking life, all the forms of the negative have two sources, one turn outward and the other inward, resentment, bad conscience, hatred, guilt, the two arch enemies of the human race, hatred and remorse. Um, he denounces these sources again and again as being linked to man's consciousness, as being inexhaustible until there is a new conscious, a new vision, a new appetite for living. Spinoza feels, experiences that he is eternal. That's a monism, the eternal. Um, in Spinoza's thought, life is not an idea, a matter of theory. It is a way of being. Life is a way of being, one and the same eternal mode in all its attributes. And it is only from this perspective that the geometric method is fully comprehensible. Oops, Metzinger. In ethics, it is in opposition to what Spinoza calls satire. Satire is everything that takes pleasure in the powerlessness. Uh, I think I'll just stop. I think we can talk about this stuff. It seems familiar ground. There's so many good parts in this end here, though. One of the things that I'm trying to write as I'm reading, at the same time, um, is and now I've just made super chicken scratch here, but like there just the just the advancements in like science and understanding of human neurology, human neuroscience. um we'll read I'm hoping that we can read some Thomas Ligotti, who's a
Mm,
horror fiction writer
mm,
and wrote this nonfiction book called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. And he's an anti-natalist, um, and you know, probably a solitary person as well. So quite the negation. He references Schopenhauer quite often. Anti-natalist, pessimistic, um, personality, but he suffers from, I think, maybe a neurological or some sort of disorder where he's like unable to experience joy or pleasure or something like that.
mm,
So it's that kind of explains a little his demeanor a little bit.
mm,
Um, but Legati also uh, introduced me to this neuroscientist Thomas Metzinger, who basically talks about like philosophical ideas about free will and determinism,
mm,
and like basically like what we are like as humans and our concepts of like our agency and just things about consciousness. And consciousness is a big deal in accelerationism as well.
mm.
Say artificial consciousness, artificial intelligence, consciousness of capital, stuff like that. Um, and sort of like that, like in a horrifying kind of way, like the lens of or the bringing the genre of horror um to consciousness and stuff like that and capitalism. So what else? I feel like we're about to wrap up pretty soon.
Yeah.
What else you got?
The last thing I underlined in this chapter is when it's mentioned this thing about the third eye. I'm not exactly sure what that is. Um and
That's
but when it does get mentioned, let's see. I'll just read the sentence. The purpose of demonstration functioning as the third eye is not to command or even to convince, but only to shape the glass or polish the lens for this inspired free vision. So to me, I think what Deleuze is trying to say is that Spinoza is not trying to command or convince you of a certain thing you should believe in,
it's
because
not it's not moralizing.
yeah, because that would be the kind of like the political acts that he sees are like happening around him,
Right.
uh, that he kind of sees as like not good.
Mm.
Um, instead,
Driving people with sad passions,
yeah, instead he's
resentments,
polishing a lens for the
revelation,
potential. Like I found to use this
epiphany,
metaphor a little bit more. It's like
expansion.
he's not telling you where to put the lens yourself to see things.
He's just making
He's
a better lens for you.
exactly.
Yeah.
He wants you to just have a better lens. So
Mm.
when you actually do point it at something, you're not looking at the effect, the way it's the
Mm.
effect is playing on your lens, perhaps.
Right. Or your perception, your ability to perceive.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because then you might be looking at like a funhouse mirror lens that
This,
distorts.
yeah, distortions, blinders, whatever. Yeah. Right.
Mhm.
Metaphorically, politically, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, whether or not we can actually get to a good lens, that's a question. Maybe as humans we're always going to have our biased lens, but I think I it's interesting to at least be like to think if there is a way to get a better lens, to constantly get a better lens.
As some sort of mission or what?
Yeah, as a mission or even if it's a possibility. Like
Mm,
sometimes like the we don't even know what a body can do.
mm.
We're going to keep referencing that, right?
Over and over. It's my favorite quote.
Um, so it's like, well, you could just say, oh, well, this is how the lens is always going to be. It's never going to change, so let's just leave it that way.
Mm.
The body's always going to, we know the body does this and this and this. But if you let yourself have the just a little opening of, well, what can the body still do? Then I think that allows you to go along with something.
And it's one in the same. There is no distinction between the body and the mind. Um,
Mm,
and so everything in the body is in the mind, and the mind is in the body. Um,
that's what
and
Spinoza's
that
thinking
that's
is.
that's well, yes. It's actually Spinoza's kind of response to Descartes' kind of thoughts as well, about the mind-body problem. And so say, taking the lens as like a metaphor, um, and improving it, composition, decomposition, making it stronger, making the mind and the body stronger, say maybe more open, um, stuff like that.
Ooh, maybe that's a better way of saying it is a dirty lens will close off vision.
Mm,
So technically you could still look through it, but you have such a limited way of looking at things. Whereas the more accurate you could get your lens, the more open you could actually be to like maybe the field of vision
mm.
that is possible.
Yeah, I think like with Metzinger, and take the quote like we do not yet know what a body can do. I think that is a perennial statement that can, like, the understanding of the concept, the understanding of humans in every component of humans, like as many topics as there are in humans, um, will never be exhausted entirely. But um, but if we just take the like in the advancements that we've made in, say, sciences like neuroscience, you know, and Metzinger, or just neuroscience in general, like bodies, that we we just know now, like how much like the brain is connected to like your gut. Like
Mm.
there's a really strong connect. Like your gut health is determining so much of your your capacity to think, or your gut, like there's an ecology that is the biome inside of your gut, and everything is like driven kind of like some we think of you know our minds and our thoughts we think are the exclusive are at an exclusive domain, and this goes to the free will determinism kind of stuff. um, we think that it's a top down mind over body kind of thing. The mind drives whatever, but yes, the gut has as much to play on the mind as vice versa, and there it's a it's maybe more ridiculous to think that there is a distinction
Hmm.
between those two things, whereas like it's kind of one and the same.
Does
um
Nietzsche mention a lot of gut stuff in his writings,
um
like stomach stuff?
that's a good question. I don't know. I
I feel like
mean,
he mentions things like, yeah, like having a strong stomach or constitution or something, or
yeah,
bad
probably.
smells
Yeah, right,
are not good.
right. um a little bit more in Nietzsche's like that. I was kind of laughing at that whole like satire thing, because to me, like, satire isn't like within like the an exclusive domain of like political. It's not exclusive to on this on one end of the spectrum of
Mm,
politics.
hmm.
um but it seems to be more, eh, satire comes maybe more from like critical thought. um Critical thought comes from, I would say, would be on uh an opposing end of a spectrum from just reactionary politics.
Mm,
And so maybe satire comes more from like potentially not exclusively, but more towards like the left, like a left bent, right?
mm,
But um, Nietzsche and Spinoza are both talking shit about satire,
mm,
and but I guess and that goes with like the resentments. So you know, kind of, it, it's not important, but it just kind of cracks me up
mm,
to read how Spinoza had a distaste for um, satire, and it
mm,
seems that maybe the place for that is just that he had spent so much time in thought and being a rationalist and making like a priori statements or thoughts, right? Reasoning from the mind or whatever, that he he came to those conclusions that satire is no good.
mm.
Um, but it's like, but we love satire. Satire's fucking great.
Well, I've thought about this. This is kind of like a tangent of sorts, but that we kind of live in a time where irreverence is pretty common amongst our American culture.
Mm,
So I don't know, a lot of the philosophers and thinkers we reference do come from like the Western European canon of things. And it might just be kind of more of a recent thing where humor is taken to be part of a meaningful uh, part of the discussion of things. Um, like it's humor is not something necessarily that you would write in your philosophical text, um, for like future generations to reference to. But in some ways, I feel like Nietzsche kind of starts to do that.
mm.
Um, I
He's a
guess
good shit talker.
that yeah, I guess that's what I mean is like uh so at
I
least
wonder what distinguishes what he's saying from what would be considered what they might consider a satire.
yeah.
Um,
But I just
maybe
think
it's a semantical thing that is context to time and space or something. I don't know.
mhm. But yeah, how much of like humor is more of like a recent phenomena with people could still like listen to serious ideas, but humor doesn't necessarily detract from uh like still thinking through those things. Um, I don't know. It's interesting.
Well, let's pick can you pick a quote for today's reading? Your most evocative, provocative quotes.
Hmm. Uh, I don't know. Because I guess we'd be directly quoting Deleuze most likely, not anything specifically Spinoza says.
Could be Arnoness.
Or I guess Arnines, I guess in the preface as well.
But yeah, I mean anybody. Um,
I don't know,
Spinoza, Deleuze, or anyone else.
maybe the
If there's
preface one was interesting where you read it again. The what were the
it might
examples?
just be
Like
Spinoza is difficult.
the wolf, you were like saying like the wolf, the
Yes.
river.
What are we capable, what we are capable of may partake of the wolf, the river, the stone in the river. Was that it?
Yeah. But I guess it's like this
Is it before that?
where is that?
Nature, nature itself is an individual composed of all modes of interaction. Deleuze opens us to the idea, which I take as a contribution to ecological thought. The elements of the different individuals we may compose may be non-human within us.
I think that
That was
one,
a strong one.
yeah, because we'll kind of learn a little bit more of like how that kind of plays out with the ideas of the passions interacting with bodies,
Mm,
just basically like different bodies interacting with each other and how that has effects.
mm.
Um,
As well
because
as
that leads into del
transhuman, post-human,
exactly
non-human,
that starts to get us to think about what does it mean.
the coldness of capital. Um,
Yeah,
um, that's a good one. Um, I guess the only, I mean, not the only one, but uh, something on the whole like life bit um, is maybe the big takeaway ones as well. Let's see. I think, yeah, I'll say that um, yeah, I guess just this frugal, propertyless life undermined by illness, this thin, frail body, this brown oval face with its sparkling black eyes. How does one explain the impression they give of being suffused with life itself, of having a power identical to life? Um, and then maybe, let's see. Yeah, I think it's over here. Yeah. Um, People have asked whether the ethics should be read in terms of thought or in terms of power. For example, are the attributes powers or concepts? Actually, there's only one term, life. That encompasses thought. But conversely, this term is encompassed only by thought. Not that life is in thinking, but only the thinker has a potential life, free of guilt and hatred, and only life explains the thinker. I think that's the one. Okay, cool.
choose life.
Live a life.
Live a little, think a little, live a little. That's
Give a
all we want.
little bit of that.
All right, peace.